Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and this is part 2 of my Silent Hill 2 Pyramid Head helmet build. If you did not watch part 1, go check that one out, because in that video, I went all over the fabrication of the helmet. In part 2, we're going to be talking about painting and weathering, and I gotta say, I am extremely happy with how this one has turned out. This is by far one of the best rust painting tutorials I have ever done, and even if you're not building Pyramid Head, you can definitely watch this video and pick up some tips and tricks to use in your future builds. Now, like I'd mentioned in the past, this helmet is made completely out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials, and because of that, it only weighs 2 pounds. But with this paint job, it definitely does not look like that. So I want to show you what it takes to paint this helmet up. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start by taking the helmet outside and covering it with 2 to 3 light coats of Plasti-Dip. After the Plasti-Dip had cured, I'm going to apply a dusting of Krylon Oxide Red Primer. Now take note that I don't completely cover the surface because primer can crack. I'm also allowing some of the black Plasti-Dip to show through. Rust-Oleum flat iron is lightly applied to the helmet just for that little bit of metallic glint. And as a final pass, I add a little more red oxide to certain spots. With Pyramid Head's helmet primed, it's now time to add an acrylic wash to the entire surface. To do this, I'm going to use Liquitex Mars Black and a 1-inch mop brush. A ton of water is added to the pigment and it's generously brushed across the surface. Once a section had been completely covered, I'll then go back with a damp paper towel to remove some of the paint. I do this so that the paint seeps down into all the details that I'd sculpted, plus this also preps the surface for additional layers of acrylic. And with your project, feel free to add as many or as few layers to the helmet as you would like. With the wash complete, I can now go back with a second coating to certain areas with that Mars Black. But this time I'm adding less water to the pigment and I'm using a smaller mop brush. This allows me to better control the paint and add it to those textures that I had sculpted in the part 1 video. And just like the wash, I'll go back and remove some of the pigment, especially around the edges, to alleviate brush strokes. Using an even smaller filbert brush, I can now use a concentrated version of the Mars Black on the textured areas. To give a variation in the surface colors, I apply a layer of Dirty Down Rust Aging Spray. Now this spray is water activated, so by putting water onto the surface and removing the paint in those areas, it gives it a really cool effect. And you can always speed up this process by using a hairdryer. Now when I'm applying the water, I'm picking spots where a lot of grime would build up, or large flat areas that I need to visually break up. After I'm done with all the water techniques, I seal the entire helmet with some flat Krylon spray. I'd like to add some highlights to the textured sections, so I'm going to be using some neutral gray and burnt sienna, both from Liquitex. I apply the paint to the center of the most heavily textured sections and then I feather that out. And this is where I would recommend to look at references for rust because there are so many color variations. Additional Mars Black can be added to these sections, and I once again use the damp paper towel method to remove some of the paint, but notice that the lighter colors that I just applied are on the peaks of these textures. So as the black paint seeps down, the peaks have a highlight. Because this helmet is a very large piece, it's a constant back and forth. I make sure to step back about 6 to 10 feet to take the entire piece in and determine where I need to add more highlights or more shadows. It's time to start adding the first layer of a rust highlight, and this is going to be done using a mixture of Liquitex Red Oxide and Raw Sienna. Now this is a wash, but I'm not putting it all over. I'm selectively putting it around the heavily textured areas. And just like before, I'm removing some of that pigment along the perimeter. Now placement of these highlights is going to be completely up to you, but I would recommend to pick certain areas as focal points, versus placing this pigment all over the entire piece. Not only will it add more visual interest, but because the helmet is very large, it will move your eye around the piece. While this layer dries, I go in with a detail brush and some Mars Black to paint in all of the gouges that I had applied in part 1. For my second pass at the rusty areas, I'm applying more red oxide. This time, just like the black, I'm applying the pigment but with less water. That way the paint comes across as a little more opaque, and that really helps because I'm building up these rusty hues layer by layer. And you guys know me, I love my layers. And like I'd mentioned before, be even more specific with the application of this paint. We're trying now to have distinct concentrations of rust in certain areas. So think about how water and rust would pool if this helmet was exposed to the elements. Keep going back with this red oxide, adding less and less water every time. There's really no wrong way to do this, and your layers are so thin that if you get it in a spot you don't like, you could easily mop it up. I move over to a small filbert brush, and this is where the concentration of the pigment really starts to be amplified. I'm selectively placing this paint around the outside edges of some of the heaviest textures. After the paint has been applied, I'll then use dry brushes or paper towels to feather that pigment away. You want to look as though a chemical reaction is happening at this oxidation point. As always, real-world references are your friend, and if you just Google rusty metal, you'll find a ridiculous amount of images to base your creation off of. At this point, the helmet was looking pretty good, but I still had more highlights to add. I was invited as a cosplay guest out at a convention in Kansas City, so I decided to take my helmet with me and paint at my booth. The highlight layers of raw sienna that I'm applying now are going to be on top of the concentration of red oxide that I applied earlier. Just like all the other colors that have been applied, I start the process with a watered down layer. Some of this pigment is removed with a paper towel, and then I can slowly build this up layer upon layer. And I'm still backing off 6 to 10 feet from time to time to check out the look of the overall piece. A concentrated version of the raw sienna can be applied with a liner brush. Most of the time this is painted onto the surface where the textured area meets the flat foam. This layer in particular really starts to show a weathered separation in between the various textures. A final pass of the raw sienna and some yellow oxide is applied to the smallest areas. The paint is applied with almost no water added to it and with a very small detail brush. This makes sure that I get a very concentrated color, especially down in between the textures. And I will say this entire process was very time consuming, but I'm extremely happy with the end results. Even if you weren't making Pyramid Head, you could definitely use this painting technique on a lot of different builds. Now, I believe the ring at the top symbolizes his wedding ring, so to make it stand out just a little bit, I'm going to add some iridescent rich bronze. Instead of painted, this is going to be stippled onto the surface. This will allow some of the previous colors to show through and give it an aged look. The little metal piece near the bottom is also going to be painted this way. Now in the game it has a silver reflection, so I'm going to add some graphite powder. The powder is going to be brushed onto the piece, and then using a shop towel I press it onto the surface. Buffing the graphite powder this way gives it a metallic sheen, but it's a little too much and needs to show some wear. So like the other rusty areas, I apply some watered down red oxide. So I found some new references from the game that shows that the helmet should concave in here a little bit. First up, I'm going to slice the inside with a hobby blade, making sure not to go all the way through. Then using a heat gun, I open that cut up and make the foam more malleable. Pressing the foam in from the opposite side to get the desired depth, I could then fill the cut with hot glue. This will make sure that the foam retains this shape. So you all can see what it takes to paint and weather Pyramid Head's helmet from Silent Hill 2. And if you would like to make your own, I of course have free PDF files available over on my website with links in the description section. And if you are building any of my builds or utilizing HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I love seeing your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD foam.